paid my dues, time after time. I've done my sentence, but committed no crime.
And here we go with Chapter 6, Investigation of Possible Conspiracies, Part 4. There's 15 parts in there, this one.
Section 27, Report of the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, the Warren Commission Report. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Report of the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, the Warren Commission Report, by the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. Chapter 6, Investigation of Possible Conspiracy, Part 4. Oswald's departure from the Soviet Union. On February the 13th, 1961, the American Embassy in Moscow received a letter from Oswald, postmarked Minsk, February the 5th, asking that he be readmitted to the United States. This was the first time that the embassy had heard from or about Oswald since November the 16th, 1959. The end of the 15-month silence came only a few days after the Department of State in Washington had forwarded a request to the Moscow Embassy on February the 1st, 1961, informing the embassy that Oswald's mother was worried about him and asking that he get in touch with her if possible. The simultaneity of the two events was apparently coincidental. The request from Marguerite Oswald went from Washington to Moscow by sealed diplomatic pouch, and there was no evidence that the seal had been tampered with. The officer of the Department of State who carried the responsibility for such matters has testified that the message was not forwarded to the Russians after it arrived in Moscow. Oswald's letter does not seem to have been designed to ingratiate him with the embassy officials. It starts by incorrectly implying that he had written an earlier letter that was not answered, states that he will return to the United States only if he can first, quote, come to some agreement, unquote, on there being no legal charges brought against him, and ends with a reminder to the officials at the embassy that they have a responsibility to do everything they can to help him, since he is an American citizen. The embassy's response to this letter was to invite Oswald to come personally to Moscow to discuss the matter. Oswald at first protested because of the difficulty of obtaining Soviet permission. He wrote 2 more protesting letters during the following 4 months, but received no indication that the embassy would allow him to handle the matter by mail. While the Department of State was clarifying its position on this matter, Oswald unexpectedly appeared in Moscow on Saturday, July the 8th, 1961. On Sunday, Marina Oswald flew to Moscow and was interviewed by officials in the American Embassy on Tuesday. The Commission asked the Department of State and the Central Intelligence Agency to comment on whether the Oswalds' travel to Moscow without permission signified special treatment by the Soviet Union. From their responses, it appears that since Marina Oswald possessed the Soviet citizen's internal passport, she did not require prior approval to make the trip. Although Soviet law did require her husband, as the holder of a stateless passport, to obtain advance permission for the trip. His failure to do so would not normally have been considered a serious violation. In this respect, the CIA has advised the Commission as follows. Oswald's travel from Minsk to Moscow and return in July 1961 would normally have required prior authorization. Bearers of a Soviet, quote, passport for foreigners, unquote, are required to obtain travel authorization from the Visa and Registration Department, OVIR, or Passport Registration Department, PRO, in smaller towns if they desire to leave the city or oblast where they are domiciled. This same requirement is believed to apply to persons such as Oswald holding Soviet, quote, stateless passports, unquote. The practicality of even unauthorized travel was demonstrated by events related by a United States citizen who defected in 1960 and subsequently was sent to Kiev to study. After repatriating, this defector told US authorities he had made a total of 7 unauthorized trips from Kiev during his stay in the USSR. He was apprehended on 2 of his flights and was returned to Kiev each time, the second time under escort. On both occasions, he was merely reprimanded by the deputy chief of the institute at which he was studying. Since Marina had a Soviet citizen's internal passport, there would have been no restrictions against her making the trip to Moscow. The answers of the Department of State, together with the Commission's specific questions, are as follows. B. Could resident foreigners normally travel in this manner without first obtaining such permission? Answer. There are only a few US nationals now living in the Soviet Union. They include an American Roman Catholic priest, an American Protestant minister, a number of correspondents, some students, and technical advisors to Soviet businesses. We know that the priest, the minister, the correspondents, and the students must obtain permission from Soviet authorities before taking any trips. The technical advisors notify officials of their project before they travel, and these officials personally inform the militia. C. If travel of this type was not freely permitted, do you believe that Oswald normally would have been apprehended during the attempt or punished after the fact for traveling without permission? Answer. Based on the information we have, we believe that if Oswald went to Moscow without permission and this was known to the Soviet authorities, he would have been fined or reprimanded. Oswald was not, of course, an average foreign resident. He was a defector from a foreign country and the bearer of a Soviet internal stateless passport during the time when he was contemplating a visit to Moscow to come to the embassy. The Soviet authorities probably knew about Oswald's trip, even if he did not obtain advance permission, since in most instances the Soviet militia guards at the embassy asked for the documents of unidentified persons entering the embassy grounds. An American citizen who, with her American citizen husband, went to the Soviet Union to live permanently and is now trying to obtain permission to leave, informed the embassy that she had been fined for not getting permission to go from Odessa to Moscow on a recent trip to visit the embassy. D. Even if such travel did not have to be authorized, do you have any information or observations regarding the practicality of such travel by Soviet citizens or persons in Oswald's status? Answer. It is impossible to generalize in this area. We understand from interrogations of former residents in the Soviet Union who were considered, quote, stateless, unquote, by Soviet authorities, that they were not permitted to leave the town where they resided without permission of the police. In requesting such permission, they were required to fill out a questionnaire giving the reason for travel, length of stay, address of individuals to be visited, etc. Notwithstanding these requirements, we know that at least one stateless person often traveled without permission of the authorities and stated that police stationed at railroad stations usually spot-checked the identification papers of every 10th traveler, but that it was an easy matter to avoid such checks. Finally, he stated that persons who were caught evading the registration requirements were returned to their hometowns by the police and sentenced to short jail terms and fined. These sentences were more severe for repeated violations. When Oswald arrived at the embassy in Moscow, he met Richard E. Snyder, the same person with whom he had dealt in October of 1959. Primarily on the basis of Oswald's interview with Snyder on Monday, July the 10th, 1961, the American embassy concluded that Oswald had not expatriated himself. On the basis of this tentative decision, Oswald was given back his American passport, which he had surrendered in 1959. The document was due to expire in September 1961, however, and Oswald's renewal would depend upon the ultimate decision by the Department of State on his expatriation. On July the 11th, Marina Oswald was interviewed at the embassy, and the steps necessary for her to obtain an American visa were begun. In May 1962, after 15 months of dealing with the embassy, Oswald's passport was ultimately renewed and permission for his wife to enter the United States was granted. The files on Oswald and his wife, compiled by the Department of State and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, contain no indication of any expert guidance by Soviet authorities in Oswald's dealings with the department or the service. For example, the letters from Minsk to the embassy in Moscow, which are in his handwriting, display the arrogant attitude which was characteristic of him both before and after he lived in Russia, and when compared with other letters that were without doubt composed and written by him, show the same low level of sophistication, fluency, and spelling. The department officer who most frequently dealt with Oswald when he began negotiations to return to the United States, Richard E. Snyder, testified that he can recall nothing that indicated Oswald was being guided or assisted by a third party when he appeared at the embassy in July 1961. On the contrary, the arrogant and presumptuous attitude which Oswald displayed in his correspondence with the embassy from early 1961 until June 1962, when he finally departed from Russia, undoubtedly hindered his attempts to return to the United States. Snyder has testified that although he made a sincere effort to treat Oswald's application objectively, Oswald's attitude made this very difficult. In order to leave Russia, it was also necessary for the Oswalds to obtain permission from the Soviet government. The timing and circumstances under which the Oswalds obtained this permission have also been considered by the Commission. Marina Oswald, although her memory is not clear on the point, said that she and Oswald first made their intentions to go to the United States known to the Soviet officials in Minsk in May, even before coming to Moscow in July for the conference at the American Embassy. The Oswald's correspondence with the embassy and the documents furnished the Commission by the Soviet government show that the Oswalds made a series of formal applications to the Soviets from July the 15th to August 21st. Presumably, the most difficult question for the Soviet authorities was whether to allow Marina Oswald to accompany her husband. She was called to the local passport office in Minsk on December the 25th, 1961, and told that authority had been received to issue exit visas to her.
Hey Mike, how you doing?
Obtaining the permission of the Soviet government to leave may have been aided by a conference which Marina Oswald had at her own request with the local MVD official, Colonel Aksenov, sometime in late 1961. She testified that she applied for the conference at her husband's urging, after he had tried unsuccessfully to arrange such a conference for himself. She believed that it may have been granted to her because her uncle, with whom she had lived in Minsk before her marriage, was also an MVD official. The correspondence with the American embassy at this time reflected that the Oswalds did not pick up their exit visas immediately. On January the 11th, 1962, Marina Oswald was issued her Soviet exit visa. It was marked valid until December the 1st, 1962. The Oswalds did not leave Russia until June 1962, but the additional delay was caused by problems with the US government and by the birth of a child in February. Permission of the Soviet authorities to leave, once again, was never revoked. Oswald told the FBI in July 1962, shortly after he returned to the United States, that he had been interviewed by the MVD twice. Once when he first came to the Soviet Union, and once just before he departed. His wife testified that the second interview did not occur in Moscow, but that she and her husband dealt with the MVD visa officials frequently in Minsk. Investigation of the circumstances, including the timing under which the Oswalds obtained permission from the Soviet government to leave Russia for the United States, shows that they differed in no discernible manner from the normal. The Central Intelligence Agency has informed the Commission that normally a Soviet national would not be permitted to emigrate if he might endanger Soviet national security once he went abroad. Those persons in possession of confidential information, for example, would constitute an important category of such security risks. Apparently, Oswald's pre-departure interview by the MVD was part of an attempt to ascertain whether he or his wife had access to any confidential information. Marina Oswald's reported interview with the MVD late 1961, which was arranged at her request, may have served the same purpose. The Commission's awareness of both interviews derives entirely from Oswald and his wife's statements and letters to the American Embassy, which which afford additional evidence that the conferences carried no subversive significance. It took the Soviet authorities at least 5.5 months, from about July 15, 1961, until late December, to grant permission for the Oswalds to leave the country. When asked to comment upon the alleged rapidity of the Oswalds' departure, the Department of State advised the Commission. In the immediate post-war period, there were about 15 marriages in which the wife had been waiting for many years for a Soviet exit permit. After the death of Stalin, the Soviet government showed a disposition to settle these cases. In the summer of 1953, permission was given for all of this group of Soviet citizen wives to accompany their American citizen husbands to the United States. Since this group was given permission to leave the Soviet Union, there have been from time to time marriages in the Soviet Union of American citizens and Soviet citizens. With one exception, it is our understanding that all of the Soviet citizens involved have been given permission to emigrate to the United States after waiting periods, which were in some cases from 3 to 6 months and in others much longer. Both the Department of State and the Central Intelligence Agency compiled data for the Commission on Soviet wives of American citizens who received exit visas to leave the Soviet Union, where the relevant information was available. In both cases, the data were consistent with the above conclusion of the State Department. The Department of State had sufficient information to measure the time span in 14 cases. The Department points out that it has information on the dates of application for and receipt of Soviet exit visas only on those cases that have been brought to its attention. The common reason for bringing a case to the attention of the Department is that the granting of the exit visa by the Soviet Union has been delayed, so that the American spouse seeks the assistance of his own government. It therefore appears that the sampling data carry a distinct bias towards lengthy waiting periods. Of the 14 cases tested, 6 involved women who applied for visas after 1953, when the liberalized post-Stalin policy was in effect. The approximate waiting periods for these wives were, in decreasing order, 13 months, 6 months, 8 months, 1 month, and 10 days. Of the 11 cases examined by the Central Intelligence Agency, in which the time period is known or can be inferred, Soviet wives had to wait from 5 months to a year to obtain exit visas. In his correspondence with the American Embassy and his brother while he was in Russia, in his diary, and in his conversations with people in the United States after he returned, Oswald claimed that his wife had been subjected to pressure by the Soviet government in an effort to induce her not to emigrate to the United States. In the embassy correspondence, Oswald claimed that the pressure had been so intense that she had to be hospitalized for 5 days for, quote, nervous exhaustion, unquote. Marina Oswald testified that her husband exaggerated and that no such hospitalization or nervous exhaustion ever occurred. However, she did testify that she was questioned on the matter occasionally and given the impression that her government was not pleased with her decision. Her aunt and uncle in Minsk did not speak to her, quote, for a long time, unquote. She also stated that she was dropped from membership in the communist youth organization, Komsomol, when the news of her visit to the American embassy in Moscow reached that organization. A student who took Russian lessons from her in Texas testified that she once referred to the days when the pressure was applied as, quote, a very horrible time, unquote. Despite all this, Marina Oswald testified that she was surprised that their visas were granted as soon as they were, and that hers was granted at all. This evidence thus indicates that the Soviet authorities, rather than facilitating the departure of the Oswalds, first tried to dissuade Marina Oswald from going to the United States, and then, when she failed to respond to the pressure, permitted her to leave without undue delay. There are indications that the Soviet treatment of another recent defector who left the Soviet Union to return to the United States resembled that accorded to the Oswalds. On the basis of all the foregoing evidence, the Commission concluded that there was no reason to believe that the Oswalds received unusually favorable treatment in being permitted to leave the Soviet Union. Associations in the Dallas-Fort Worth community, the Russian-speaking community. Shortly after his return from Russia in June 1962, Oswald and his family settled in Fort Worth, Texas, where they met a group of Russian-born or Russian-speaking persons in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The members of this community were attracted to each other by common background, language, and culture. Many of them were well-educated, accomplished, and industrious people, several being connected with the oil exploration, production, and processing industry that flourishes in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. As described more fully in Chapter 7, many of these persons assisted the Oswalds in various ways. Some provided the Oswalds with gifts of such things as food, clothing, and baby furniture. Some arranged appointments and transportation for medical and dental treatment, and assumed the cost in some instances. When Oswald undertook to look for employment in Dallas in early October of 1962, and again when marital difficulties arose between the Oswalds in November of the same year, Marina Oswald and their child were housed at times in the homes of various members of the group. The Commission has examined the background of many of these individuals and has thoroughly investigated Oswald's relationship with them. There is no basis to suppose that Oswald came to Fort Worth upon his return from Russia for the purpose of establishing contacts with the Russian-speaking community located in that area. Oswald had spent several of his grammar school years in Fort Worth. In 1962, his brother Robert lived in Fort Worth, and his mother resided in nearby Vernon, Texas. In January of that year, Oswald indicated to American officials in Russia that he intended to stay with his mother upon his return to the United States. However, sometime after mid-February, he received an invitation to stay with Robert and his family until he became settled. And he did spend the first several weeks after his return at Robert's home. In July, Oswald's mother moved to Fort Worth, and Oswald and his wife and child moved into an apartment with her. While in that apartment, Oswald located a job in Fort Worth, and then rented and moved with his family into an apartment on Mercedes Street. Upon his arrival in 1962, Oswald did not know any members of the relatively small and loosely knit Russian-speaking community. Shortly after his arrival, Oswald obtained the name of 2 Russian-speaking persons in Fort Worth from the office of the Texas Employment Commission in that city. Attempts to arrange a prompt visit with one of them failed. The second person, Peter Paul Gregory, was a consulting petroleum engineer and part-time Russian language instructor at the Fort Worth Public Library. Oswald contacted him in order to obtain a letter certifying to his proficiency in Russian, and Marina Oswald later tutored his son in the Russian language. Gregory introduced the Oswalds to George Buhay and Anna Miller, both of whom lived in Dallas, and became interested in the welfare of Marina Oswald and her child. Through them, other members of the Russian community became acquainted with the Oswalds. The Oswalds met some 30 persons in the Russian-speaking community, of whom 25 testified before the Commission or in staff. Others were interviewed on behalf of the Commission. This range of testimony has disclosed that the relationship between Lee Harvey Oswald and the Russian-speaking community was short-lived and generally quite strained. During October and November of 1962, Marina Oswald lived at the homes of some of the members of the Russian-speaking community. She stayed first with Eleanor Hall while Oswald was looking for work in Dallas. In early November, Marina Oswald and the baby joined Oswald in Dallas, but soon thereafter she spent approximately 2 weeks with different Russian-speaking friends during another separation. Oswald openly resented the help Marina's Russian friends gave to him and his wife, and the efforts of some of them to induce Marina to leave him. George Buhay attempted to dissuade Marina from returning to her husband in November 1962, and when she rejoined him, Buhay became displeased with her as well. Relations between the Oswalds and the members of the Russian community had practically ceased by the end of 1962. Catherine Ford, one of the members of the group, summed up the situation as it existed at the end of January 1963. Quote, "So it was rather, sort of, Marina and her husband were dropped at that time. Nobody actually wanted to help." Unquote. End of section 27.
Yeah, they're trying to discredit the Russian connection, saying that Russia was involved in the assassination. That was part of part 5.
Section 28 of Report of the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. The Warren Commission Report. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Report of the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. The Warren Commission Report. By the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. Chapter 6. Investigation of Possible Conspiracy, Part 5. In April of 1963, Oswald left Fort Worth for New Orleans, where he was later joined by his wife and daughter, and remained until his trip to Mexico City in late September, and his subsequent return to the Dallas-Fort Worth area in early October of 1963. With only minor exceptions, there is no evidence that any member of the Russian-speaking community had further contact with Oswald or his family after April. In New Orleans, Oswald made no attempt to make new Russian-speaking acquaintances for his wife, and there is no evidence that he developed any friendships in that city. Similarly, after the return from New Orleans, there seems to have been no communication between the Oswalds and this group until the evening of November the 22nd, 1963, when the Dallas police enlisted Ilya Mamatov to serve as an interpreter for them in their questioning of Marina Oswald. George de Mohorenschild and his wife, both of whom speak Russian as well as several other languages, however, did continue to see the Oswalds on occasion, up to about the time Oswald went to New Orleans on April the 24th, 1963. De Mohorenschild was apparently the only Russian-speaking person living in Dallas for whom Oswald had appreciable respect, and this seems to have been true, even though de Mohorenschild helped Marina Oswald leave her husband for a period in November of 1962. In connection with the relations between Oswald and de Mohorenschild, the Commission has considered testimony concerning an event which occurred shortly after Oswald shot at General Walker. The de Mohorenschiilds came to Oswald's apartment on Neely Street for the first time on the evening of April the 13th, 1963, apparently to bring an Easter gift for the Oswald's child. Mrs. de Mohorenschild testified that while Marina Oswald was showing her the apartment, she saw a rifle with a scope in a closet. Mrs. de Mohorenschild then told her husband in the presence of the Oswalds that there was a rifle in the closet. Mrs. de Mohorenschild testified that, quote, George, of course, with his sense of humor, Walker was shot a few days ago within that time. He said, did you take a pot shot at Walker by any chance? Unquote. At that point, Mr. de Mohorenschild testified. Oswald, quote, sort of shriveled, you see, when I asked this question, made a peculiar face and changed the expression on his face, unquote, and remarked that he did target shooting. Marina Oswald testified that the de Mohorenschiilds came to visit a few days after the Walker incident, and that when de Mohorenschild made his reference to Oswald's possibly shooting at Walker, Oswald's, quote, face changed. He almost became speechless, unquote. According to the de Mohorenschiilds, Mr. de Mohorensschild's remark was intended as a joke, and he had no knowledge of Oswald's involvement in the attack on Walker. Nonetheless, the remark appears to have created an uncomfortable silence, and the de Mohorenschiilds left, quote, very soon afterwards, unquote. They never saw either of the Oswalds again. They left in a few days on a trip to New York City and did not return until after Oswald had gone to New Orleans. A postcard from Oswald to de Mohorenschild was apparently the only contact they had thereafter. The de Mohorenschiilds left in early June for Haiti on a business venture, and they were still residing there at the time they testified on April the 23rd, 1964. Extensive investigation has been conducted into the background of both de Mohorenschild. The investigation has revealed that George de Mohorenschild is a highly individualistic person of varied interests. He was born in the Russian Ukraine in 1911 and fled Russia with his parents in 1921 during the civil disorder following the revolution. He was in a Polish cavalry military academy for 11 and a half years. Later, he studied in Antwerp and attended the University of Liège, from which he received a doctor's degree in international commerce in 1928. Soon thereafter, he emigrated to the United States. He became a U.S. citizen in 1949. De Mohorenschild eventually became interested in oil exploration and production. He entered the University of Texas in 1944 and received a master's degree in petroleum geology and petroleum engineering in 1945. He has since become active as a petroleum engineer throughout the world. In 1960, after the death of his son, he and his wife made an 8-month hike from the United States-Mexican border to Panama over primitive jungle trails. By happenstance, they were in Guatemala City at the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion. A lengthy film and complete written log was prepared by de Mohorenschild, and a report of the trip was made to the U.S. government. Upon arriving in Panama, they journeyed to Haiti, where de Mohorenschild eventually became involved in a government-orientated business venture in which he has been engaged continuously since June 1963 until the time of this report. The members of the Dallas-Fort Worth Russian community and others have variously described Mohorenschild as eccentric, outspoken, and a strong believer in individual liberties and in the U.S. form of government, but also of the belief that some form of undemocratic government might be best for other peoples. De Mohorenschild frankly admits his provocative personality. Jean de Mohorenschild was born in Harbin, China, of white Russian parents. She left during the war with Japan, coming to New York in 1938, where she became a successful ladies' dress and sportswear apparel designer. She married her present husband in 1959. The Commission's investigation has developed no signs of subversive or disloyal conduct on the part of either of the de Mohorenschiilds. Neither the FBI, CIA, or any witness contacted by the Commission has provided any information linking the de Mohorenschiilds to subversive or extremist organizations, nor has there been any evidence linking them in any way with the assassination of President Kennedy. The Commission has also considered closely the relations between the Oswalds and Michael and Ruth Payne of Irving, Texas. The Paynes were not part of the Russian community, which has been discussed above. Ruth Payne speaks Russian, however, and for this reason was invited to a party in February of 1963, at which she became acquainted with the Oswalds. The host had met the Oswalds through the de Mohorenschiilds. Marina Oswald and Ruth Payne subsequently became quite friendly, and Mrs. Payne provided considerable assistance to the Oswalds. Marina Oswald and her child resided with Ruth Payne for a little over 2 weeks, while Oswald sought a job in New Orleans in late April and early May 1963. In May, he transported Marina Oswald to New Orleans, paying all the traveling and other expenses. While the Oswalds were in New Orleans, the two women corresponded. Mrs. Payne came to New Orleans in late September and took Marina Oswald and her child to her home in Irving. Since Oswald left for Mexico City promptly after Mrs. Payne and his family departed New Orleans, the Commission has considered whether Ruth Payne's trip to New Orleans was undertaken to assist Oswald in this venture, but the evidence is clear that it was not. In her letters to Ruth Payne during the summer of 1963, Marina Oswald confided that she was having continuing difficulties with her husband, and Mrs. Payne urged Marina Oswald to live with her in Irving. The letters of the two women prior to Mrs. Payne's arrival in New Orleans on September the 20th, 1963, however, contain no mention that Oswald was planning a trip to Mexico City or elsewhere. The In New Orleans, Mrs. Spain was told by Oswald that he planned to seek employment in Houston or perhaps Philadelphia. Though Marina Oswald knew this to be false, she testified that she joined in this deception. At no time during the entire weekend was Mexico City mentioned. Corroboration for this testimony is found in a letter Mrs. Spain wrote to her mother shortly after she and Marina Oswald had returned to Irving on September the 24th, in which she stated that Marina Oswald was again living with her temporarily and that Oswald was job hunting. When Oswald arrived at the Payne home on October the 4th, he continued his deception by telling Mrs. Payne in his wife's presence that he had been unsuccessful in finding employment. At Oswald's request, Marina Oswald remained silent. Marina Oswald lived with Ruth Payne through the birth of her second daughter on October the 20th, 1963, and until the assassination of President Kennedy. During this period, Oswald obtained a room in Dallas and found employment in Dallas, but spent weekends with his family at the Payne home. On November the 1st and 5th, Ruth Payne was interviewed by agents of the FBI who were investigating Oswald's activities since his return from the Soviet Union, as set forth in greater detail in Chapter 8. She did not then know Oswald's address in Dallas. She was not asked, nor did she volunteer Oswald's telephone number in Dallas, which she did know. She advised the bureau agent to whom she spoke of Oswald's periodic weekend visits, and she informed him that Oswald was employed at the Texas School Book Depository building. On November the 10th, Ruth Payne discovered a draft of Oswald's letter, written the day before to the Soviet embassy in Washington, in which he indicated that he had journeyed to Mexico City and conferred with a, quote, Comrade Costain in the embassy of the Soviet Union, Mexico City, Mexico, unquote. This letter is discussed later in this chapter. Mr. and Mrs. Payne testified that although they initially assumed the letter was a figment of Oswald's imagination, the letter gave Mrs. Payne considerable misgivings. She determined that if the FBI agents returned, she would deliver to them the copy of a draft of the letter, which unknown to Oswald she had made. However, the agents did not return before the assassination. On November the 19th, Mrs. Payne learned that Oswald was living in his Dallas rooming house under an assumed name. She did not report this to the FBI because, as she testified, she, quote, had no occasion to see them and did not think it important enough to call them after that until the 23rd of November, unquote. The Commission has thoroughly investigated the background of both Paynes. Mrs. Payne was born Ruth Hyde in New York City on September the 8th, 1932. Her parents moved to Columbus, Ohio in the late 1930s. They were divorced in 1961. Ruth Payne graduated from Antioch College in 1955. While in high school, she first became interested in Quaker activities. She and her brother became Quakers in 1951. In 1952, following completion of her sophomore year at Antioch College, she was a delegate to two Friends conferences in England. At the time the Paynes met in 1955, Mrs. Payne was active in the work of the Young Friends Committee of North America, which, with the cooperation of the Department of State, was making an effort to lessen the tensions between Soviet Russia and the United States by means of the stimulation of contacts and exchange of cultures between citizens of the two nations through pen pal correspondence and exchanges of young Russians and Americans. It was during this period that Mrs. Payne became interested in the Russian language. Mrs. Payne participated in a Russian-American student exchange program sponsored by the Young Friends Committee of North America, and has participated in the pen pal phase of the activities of the Young Friends Committee. She has corresponded until recently with a school teacher in Russia. Although her active interest in the Friends program for the lessening of East-West tension ceased upon her marriage in December 1957, she has continued to hold to the tenets of the Quaker faith. Michael Payne is the son of George Lyman Payne and Ruth Forbes Payne, now Ruth Forbes Young, wife of Arthur Young of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His parents were divorced when he was 4 years of age. His father, George Lyman Payne, is an architect and resides in California. Michael Payne testified that during his late grammar and early high school days, his father participated actively in the Trotskyite faction of the communist movement in the United States, and that he attended some of those meetings. He stated that his father, with whom he has had little contact throughout most of his life, has not influenced his political thinking. He said that he has visited his father 4 or 5 times in California since 1959, but their discussions did not include the subject of communism. Since moving to Irving, Texas in 1959, he has been a research engineer for Bell Helicopter Company in Fort Worth. Mr. Payne has security clearance for his work. He has been a long-time member of the American Civil Liberties Union. Though not in sympathy with rightist political aims, he has attended a few meetings of far-right organizations in Dallas for the purpose, he testified, of learning something about those organizations, and because he, quote, was interested in seeing more communication between the right and the left, unquote. The Commission has conducted a thorough investigation of the Paynes' finances and is satisfied that their income has been from legitimate and traceable sources, and that the expenditures were consistent with their income and for normal purposes. Although in the course of their relationship with the Oswalds, the Paynes assumed expenses for such matters as food and transportation with a value of approximately $500, they made no direct payments to and received no monies or valuables from the Oswalds. Although prior to November the 22nd, Mrs. Payne had information relating to Oswald's use of an alias in Dallas, his telephone number, and his correspondence with the Soviet embassy, which he did not pass on to the FBI. The failure to have come forward with this information must be viewed within the context of the information available to her at that time. There is no evidence to contradict her testimony that she did not then know about Oswald's attack on General Walker, the presence of the rifle on the floor of the garage, Oswald's ownership of a pistol, or the photograph of Oswald displaying the firearms. She thus assumed that Oswald, though a difficult and disturbing personality, was not potentially violent, and that the FBI was cognizant of his past history and current activities. Moreover, it is from Mrs. Payne herself that the Commission has learned that she possessed the information which she did have. Mrs. Payne was forthright with the agent of the FBI, whom she spoke in early November 1963, providing him with sufficient information to have located Oswald at his job if he had deemed it necessary to do so, and a failure to have taken immediate steps to notify the Bureau of the additional information does not, under the circumstances, appear unusual. Throughout the Commission's investigation, Bruce Payne has been completely cooperative, voluntarily producing all correspondence, memoranda, and other written communications in her possession that had passed between her and Marina Oswald, both before and after November the 22nd, 1963. The Commission has had the benefit of Mrs. Payne's 1963 datebook and calendar, and her address book and telephone notation book, in both of which appear many entries relating to her activities with the Oswalds. Other material of purely personal nature was also voluntarily made available. The Commission has found nothing in the Paynes' background, activities, or finances which suggest disloyalty to the United States, and it has concluded that Ruth and Michael Payne were not involved in any way with the assassination of President Kennedy. A fuller narrative of the social context between the Oswalds and various persons of the Dallas-Fort Worth community is incorporated in Chapter 7, and the testimony of all members of the group testified before the Commission is included in the printed record which accompanies the report. The evidence establishes that the Oswalds' contacts with these people were originated and maintained under normal and understandable circumstances. The files maintained by the FBI contain no information indicating that any of the persons in the Dallas-Fort Worth community with whom Oswald associated were affiliated with any communist, fascist, or other subversive organization. During the course of this investigation, the Commission has found nothing which suggests the involvement of any member of of the Russian-speaking community in Oswald's preparations to assassinate President Kennedy. Political activities upon return to the United States. Upon his return from the Soviet Union, Oswald had dealings with the Communist Party USA, Socialist Workers' Party, and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and he also had minor contacts with at least 2 other organizations with political interests. For the purpose of determining whether Oswald received any advice, encouragement, or assistance from these organizations in planning or executing the assassination of President Kennedy, the Commission has conducted a full investigation of the nature and extent of Oswald's relations with them. The Commission has also conducted an investigation to determine whether certain persons and organizations expressing hostility to President Kennedy prior to the assassination had any connection with Lee Harvey Oswald or with the shooting of the president. Communist Party USA, Socialist Workers' Party. In August of 1962, Oswald subscribed to The Worker, a publication of the Communist Party USA. He also wrote the Communist Party to obtain pamphlets and other literature which, the evidence indicates, were sent to him as a matter of course. Oswald also attempted to initiate other dealings with the Communist Party USA, but the organization was not especially responsive. From New Orleans, he informed the party of his activities in connection with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee discussed below, submitting membership cards in his fictitious chapter to several party officials. In a letter from Arnold S. Johnson, director of the Information and Lecture Bureau of the party, Oswald was informed that although the Communist Party had no organizational ties with the committee, the party issued much literature which was, quote, important for anybody who is concerned about developments in Cuba, unquote. In September 1963, Oswald inquired how he might contact the party when he relocated in the Baltimore, Washington area, as he said he planned to do in October. And Johnson suggested in a letter on September the 19th that he, quote, get in touch with us here, New York, and we will find some way of getting in touch with you in that city, Baltimore, unquote. However, Oswald had also written asking whether, quote, handicapped as it were by his past record, he could still compete with anti-progressive forces above ground, or whether, in your opinion, he should always remain in the background, i.e. underground, unquote. And in the September 19 letter received the reply that, quote, often it is advisable for some people to remain in the background, not underground, unquote. In a letter postmarked November the 1st, Oswald informed the party that he had moved to Dallas and reported his attendance at a meeting at which General Walker had spoken and at a meeting of the American Civil Liberties Union. He asked Johnson for the party's general view of the latter organization and, quote, to what degree, if any, he should attempt to heighten its progressive tendencies, unquote. According to Johnson, this letter was not received by the Communist Party until after the assassination. At different times, Oswald also wrote The Worker and the Hall Davis Defense Committee, enclosing samples of his photographic work and offering to assist in preparing posters. He was told that, quote, his kind offer was most welcome, and from time to time we shall call on you, unquote. But he was never asked for assistance. The correspondence between Oswald and the Communist Party and all other organizations is printed in the redboard accompanying this report. When Oswald applied for a visa to enter Cuba during his trip to Mexico City, Sonora Sylvia Duran, the Cuban consular employee who dealt with Oswald, wrote on the application that Oswald said he was a member of the Communist Party and that he had, quote, displayed documents in proof of his membership, unquote. When Oswald went to Mexico, he is believed to have carried his letters from the Soviet embassy in Washington and from the Communist Party in the United States. His 1959 passport, which contains stamps showing that he had lived in Russia for 2.5 years, his Russian work permit, his Russian marriage certificate, membership cards, and newspaper clippings purporting to show his role in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and a prepared statement of his qualifications as a Marxist. Because of the mass of papers Oswald did present showing his affinity for communism, some in the Russian language, which was foreign to Sonora Duran, and because further investigation, discussed below, indicated that Oswald was not a member of the party, Sonora Duran's notation was probably inaccurate. Upon his arrest after the assassination, Oswald attempted to contact John J. Abt, a New York attorney, to request Abt to represent him. Abt was not in New York at the time, and he was never reached in connection with representing Oswald. Abt has testified that he at no time had any dealings with Oswald, and that prior to the assassination he had never heard of Lee Harvey Oswald. After his return from the Soviet Union, Oswald also carried on a limited correspondence with the Socialist Workers' Party. In October 1962, he attempted to join the party, but his application was not accepted since there was then no chapter in the Dallas area. Oswald also wrote the Socialist Workers' Party offering his assistance in preparing posters. From this organization, too, he received the response that he might be called upon if needed. He was asked for further information about his photographic skills, which he does not appear to have ever provided. Oswald did obtain literature from the Socialist Workers' Party, however, and in December 1962 he entered a subscription to the affiliated publication, The Militant. Apparently, in March of 1963, Oswald wrote the party of his activities and submitted a clipping from his letter. In response, he was told that his name was being sent to the Young Socialist Alliance for further correspondence. But the files of the alliance apparently contain no reference to Oswald. Neither the letter nor the clipping which Oswald sent has been located. Investigation by the Commission has produced no plausible evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald had any other significant contacts with the Communist Party USA, the Socialist Workers' Party, or with any other extreme leftist political organization. The FBI and other federal security agencies have made a study of their records and files and contacted numerous confidential informants of the agencies and have produced no such evidence. The Commission has questioned persons who, as a group, knew Oswald during virtually every phase of his adult life, and from none of these came any indication that Oswald maintained a surreptitious relationship with any organization. Arnold F. Johnson of the American Communist Party, James T. Tormey, Executive Secretary of the Hall Davis Defense Committee, and Farrell Dobbs, Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party, voluntarily appeared before the Commission and testified under oath that Oswald was not a member of these organizations, and that a thorough search of their files had disclosed no records relating to Oswald other than those which they produced for the Commission. The material that has been disclosed is in all cases consistent with other data in the possession of the Commission. End of section 28.
Yeah, they're doing it. Well, no one's in here, but they did this because of the supposed tie to Cuba and them training him to do it. But there's no, well, we'll find out here, but I'm sure there's no evidence to back it. Okay, here's part 7, chapter 6, part 7, investigation of possible conspiracies, section 30. Read by Maria Kesper.
Section 30 of the Report of the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, the Warren Commission Report. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Report of the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, the Warren Commission Report, by the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. Chapter 6, Investigation of Possible Conspiracy, Part 7. Contacts with the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City and the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. 8 weeks before the assassination, Oswald traveled to Mexico City, where he visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies. Note: the Soviet embassy in Mexico City includes consular as well as diplomatic personnel in a single building. The Cuban embassy and Cuban consulate in Mexico City, though in separate buildings, are in the same compound. Both the Soviet and the Cuban establishments will be referred to throughout this report simply as embassies. End note. Oswald's wife knew of this trip before he went, but she denied such knowledge until she testified before the commission. The commission undertook an intensive investigation to determine Oswald's purpose and activities on this journey, with specific reference to reports that Oswald was an agent of the Cuban or Soviet governments. As a result of its investigation, the commission believes that it has been able to reconstruct and explain most of Oswald's actions during this time. A detailed chronological account of this trip appears in Appendix 13. Trip to Mexico. Oswald was in Mexico from September 26, 1963, until October 3, 1963. Marina Oswald testified that Oswald had told her that the purpose of the trip was to evade the American prohibition on travel to Cuba and to reach that country. He cautioned her that the trip and its purpose were to be kept strictly secret. She testified that he had earlier laid plans to reach Cuba by hijacking an airliner flying out of New Orleans, but she refused to cooperate and urged him to give it up, which he finally did. Witnesses who spoke with Oswald while he was on a bus going to Mexico City also testified that Oswald told them he intended to reach Cuba by way of Mexico, and that he hoped to meet Fidel Castro after he arrived. When Oswald spoke to the Cuban and Soviet consular officials in Mexico City, he represented that he intended to travel to the Soviet Union and requested an in-transit Cuban visa to permit him to enter Cuba on September 30th on his way to the Soviet Union. Marina Oswald has testified that these statements were deceptions designed to get him to Cuba. Thus, although it is possible that Oswald intended to continue on to Russia from Cuba, the evidence makes it more likely that he intended to remain in Cuba. Oswald departed from New Orleans probably about noon on September 25th and arrived in Mexico City at about 10 a.m. on September 27th. In Mexico City, he embarked on a series of visits to the Soviet and Cuban embassies, which occupied most of his time during the first 2 days of his visit. At the Cuban embassy, he requested an in-transit visa to permit him to visit Cuba on his way to the Soviet Union. Oswald was informed that he could not obtain a visa for entry into Cuba unless he first obtained the visa to enter the USSR, and the Soviet embassy told him that he could not expect an answer on his application for a visa for the Soviet Union for about 4 months. Oswald carried with him newspaper clippings, letters, and various documents, some of them forged or containing false information, purporting to show that he was a friend of Cuba. With these papers and his record of previous residence in the Soviet Union and marriage to a Soviet national, he tried to curry favor with both embassies. Indeed, his wife testified that, in her opinion, Oswald's primary purpose for having engaged in Fair Play for Cuba committee activities was to create a public record that he was a friend of Cuba. He made himself especially unpopular at the Cuban embassy by persisting in his demands that, as a sympathizer in Cuban objectives, he ought to be given a visa. This resulted in a sharp argument with the consul, Eusebio Azque. By Saturday, September 27, 1963, Oswald had failed to obtain visas at both embassies. From Sunday, September 29th, through Wednesday morning, October 2nd, when he left Mexico City on a bus bound for the United States, Oswald spent considerable time making his travel arrangements, sightseeing, and checking again with the Soviet embassy to learn whether anything had happened on his visa application. Marina Oswald testified that when she first saw him after his return to the United States, he was disappointed and discouraged at his failure to reach Cuba. The general outlines of Oswald's activities in Mexico, particularly the nature and extent of his contacts at the Cuban embassy, were learned very early in the investigation. An important source of information relating to his business at the Cuban embassy was Senora Silvia Tirado de Duran, a Mexican national employed in the visa section of the Cuban embassy, who was questioned intensively by Mexican authorities soon after the assassination. An excerpt from the report of the Mexican government summarized the crucial portion of Senora Duran's recollection of Oswald. In translation, it reads as follows. She remembered that Lee Harvey Oswald was the name of an American who had come to the Cuban consulate to obtain a visa to travel to Cuba in transit to Russia, the latter part of September or the early part of October of this year, and in support of his application had shown his passport, in which it was noted that he had lived in that country for a period of 3 years, his labor card from the same country, written in the Russian language, and letters in the same language. He had presented evidence that he was married to a Russian woman, and also that he was apparently the leader of an organization in the city of New Orleans called Fair Play for Cuba, claiming that he should be accepted as a friend of the Cuban Revolution. Accordingly, the declarant, complying with her duties, took down all of the information and completed the appropriate application form, and the declarant, admittedly exceeding her responsibilities, informally telephoned the Russian consulate with the intention of doing what she could to facilitate the issuance of the Russian visa to Lee Harvey Oswald. However, they told her that there would be a delay of about 4 months in processing the case, which annoyed the applicant, since, according to his statement, he was in a great hurry to obtain visas that would enable him to travel to Russia, insisting on his right to do so in view of his background and his loyalty and his activities in behalf of the Cuban movement. The declarant was unable to recall accurately whether or not the applicant told her he was a member of the Communist Party, but he did say that his wife was then in New York City and would follow him. Senora Duran stated that when Oswald understood that it was not possible to give him a Cuban visa without his first having obtained the Russian visa, he became very excited or angry, and accordingly, the affiant called Consul Esque, who came out and began a heated discussion in English with Oswald that concluded with Esque telling him that if it were up to him, he would not give him the visa, and a person of his type was harming the Cuban Revolution rather than helping it. It being understood that in their conversation they were talking about the Russian Socialist Revolution and not the Cuban, Oswald maintained that he had 2 reasons for requesting that his visa be issued promptly, and they were, one, that his tourist permit in Mexico was about to expire, and the other, that he had to get to Russia as quickly as possible. Despite her annoyance, the declarant gave Oswald a paper in which she put down her name, Sylvia Duran, and the number of the telephone at the consulate, which is 112847, and the visa application was processed anyway. It was sent to the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Cuba, from which a routine reply was received some 15 to 30 days later, approving the visa but on the condition that the Russian visa be obtained first, although she does not recall whether or not Oswald later telephoned her at that consulate number that she gave him. With the dates of Oswald's entry into and departure from Mexico, which had been obtained from the records of the Mexican Immigration Service very shortly after the assassination, the government of Mexico initiated a thorough investigation to uncover as much information as possible about Oswald's trip. Representatives of U.S. agencies worked in close liaison with the Mexican law enforcement authorities. The result of this investigative effort was to corroborate the statements of Senora Duran and to verify the essentials of Oswald's activities in Mexico as outlined above. Senora Duran is a well-educated native of Mexico who was 26 years old at the time of her interrogation. She is married to Senor Horacio Duran Navarro, a 40-year-old industrial designer, and has a young child. Although Signora Duran denies being a member of the Communist Party or otherwise connected with it, both Durans have been active in the far-left political affairs of Mexico, believe in Marxist ideology, and sympathize with the government of Fidel Castro, and Signor Duran has written articles for El Dia, a pro-communist newspaper in Mexico City. The Commission has reliable evidence from a confidential source that Signora Duran, as well as other personnel at the Cuban embassy, were genuinely upset upon receiving the news of President Kennedy's death. Signora Duran's statements were made to Mexican officials soon after the assassination, and no significant inaccuracies in them have been detected. Documents fitting the description given by Signora Duran of the documents Oswald had shown her, plus a notation which she said she had given him, were found among his possessions after his arrest. The Cuban government was asked to document and confirm the essentials of Signora Duran's testimony. Its response, which has been included in its entirety in this report, included a summary statement of Oswald's activities at the Cuban embassy, a photograph of the application for a visa, which he completed there, and a photograph of the communication from Havana rejecting the application unless he could first present a Soviet visa. The information on these documents concerning Oswald's date of birth, American passport number, and activities and statements at the embassy is consistent with other information available to the Commission. CIA experts have given their opinion that the handwriting on the visa application, which purports to be Oswald's, is in fact his, and that although the handwritten notations on the bottom of the document are too brief and faint to permit a conclusive determination, they are probably Signora Duran's. The clothes which Oswald was wearing in the photograph which appears on the application appear to be the same as some of those found among his effects after the assassination, and the photograph itself appears to be from the same negative as a photograph found among his effects. Nothing on any of the documents raises a suspicion that they might not be authentic. By far the most important confirmation of Signora Duran's testimony, however, has been supplied by confidential sources of extremely high reliability available to the United States in Mexico. The information from these sources establishes that her testimony was truthful and accurate in all material respects. The identities of these sources cannot be disclosed without destroying their future usefulness to the United States. The investigation of the Commission has produced considerable testimonial and documentary evidence establishing the precise time of Oswald's journey, his means of transportation, the hotel at which he stayed in Mexico City, and a restaurant at which he often ate. All known persons whom Oswald may have met while in Mexico, including passengers on the buses he rode, and the employees and guests at the hotel where he stayed, were interviewed. No credible witness has been located who saw Oswald with any unidentified person while in Mexico City. To the contrary, he was observed traveling alone to and from Mexico City, at his hotel, and at the nearby restaurant where he frequently ate. A hotel guest stated that on one occasion he sat down at a table with Oswald at the restaurant because no empty table was available, but that neither spoke to the other because of the language barrier. 2 Australian girls who saw Oswald on the bus to Mexico City relate that he occupied a seat next to a man who has been identified as Albert Osborne, an elderly itinerant preacher. Osborne denies that Oswald was beside him on the bus. To the other passengers on the bus, it appeared that Osborne and Oswald had not previously met, and extensive investigation of Osborne has revealed no further contact between him and Oswald. Osborne's responses to federal investigators on matters unrelated to Oswald have proved inconsistent and unreliable, and therefore, based on the contrary evidence and Osborne's lack of reliability, the Commission has attached no credence to his denial that Oswald was beside him on the bus. Investigation of his background and activities, however, disclosed no basis for suspecting him of any involvement in the assassination. Investigation of the hotel at which Oswald stayed has failed to uncover any evidence that the hotel is unusual in any way that could relate to Oswald's visit. It is not especially popular among Cubans, and there is no indication that it is used as a meeting place for extremist or revolutionary organizations. Investigation of other guests at the hotel who were there when Oswald was has failed to uncover anything creating suspicion. Oswald's notebook, which he carried with him to Mexico City, contained the telephone number of the Cuban Airlines office in Mexico City. However, a Cuban visa is required by Mexican authorities before an individual may enplane for Cuba, and a confidential check of the Cuban Airlines office uncovered no evidence that Oswald visited their office while in the city. Allegations of conspiracy. Literally dozens of allegations of a conspiratorial contact between Oswald and agents of the Cuban government have been investigated by this commission. Among the claims made were allegations that Oswald had made a previous trip to Mexico City in early September to receive money and orders for the assassination, that he had been flown to a secret airfield somewhere in or near the Yucatan Peninsula, that he might have made contacts in Mexico City with a communist from the United States shortly before the assassination, and that Oswald assassinated the president at the direction of a particular Cuban agent who met with him in the United States and paid him $7,000. A letter was received from someone in Cuba alleging the writer had attended a meeting where the assassination had been discussed as part of a plan which would soon include the death of other non-communist leaders in the Americas. The charge was made in a Cuban expatriate publication that in a speech he delivered 5 days after the assassination, while he was under the influence of liquor, Fidel Castro made a slip of the tongue and said, "The first time Oswald was in Cuba," thereby giving away the fact that Oswald had made one or more surreptitious trips to that country. Some stories linked the assassination to anti-Castro groups, who allegedly were engaged in obtaining illicit firearms in the United States. One such claim being that these groups killed the president as part of a bargain with some illicit organizations who would then supply them with firearms as payment. Other rumors placed Oswald in Miami, Florida at various times, allegedly in pro-Cuban activities there. The assassination was claimed to have been carried out by Chinese communists operating jointly with the Cubans. Oswald was also alleged to have met with the Cuban ambassador in a Mexico City restaurant and to have driven off in the ambassador's car for a private talk. Castro himself, it was alleged, 2 days after the assassination, called for files relating to Oswald's dealings with 2 members of the Cuban diplomatic mission in the Soviet Union. The inference drawn was that the dealings had occurred and had established a secret subversive relationship which continued throughout Oswald's life. Without exception, these rumors and allegations of conspiratorial contact were shown to be without any factual basis, in some cases the product of mistaken identification. Illustrative of the attention given to the most serious allegations is the case of D., a young Latin American secret agent who approached U.S. authorities in Mexico shortly after the assassination and declared that he saw Lee Harvey Oswald receiving $6,500 to kill the president. Among other details, D. said that at about noon on September 18th, waiting to conduct some business at the Cuban consulate, he saw a group of 3 persons conversing in a patio a few feet away. One was a tall, thin Negro with reddish hair, obviously dyed, who spoke rapidly in both Spanish and English, and another was a man he said was Lee Harvey Oswald. A tall Cuban joined the group momentarily and passed some currency to the Negro. The Negro then allegedly said to Oswald in English, "I want to kill the man." Oswald replied, "You're not man enough, I can do it." The Negro then said in Spanish, "I can't go with you, I have a lot to do." Oswald replied, "The people are waiting for me back there." The Negro then gave Oswald $6,500 in large denomination American bills, saying, "This isn't much." After hearing this conversation, D said that he telephoned the American Embassy in Mexico City several times prior to the assassination in an attempt to report his belief that someone important in the United States was to be killed, but was finally told by someone at the embassy to stop wasting his time. D and his allegations were immediately subjected to an intensive investigation. His former employment as an agent for a Latin American country was confirmed, although his superiors had no knowledge of his presence in Mexico or the assignment described by D. 4 days after D first appeared, the U.S. government was informed by the Mexican authorities that D had admitted in writing that his whole narrative about Oswald was false. He said that he had never seen Oswald anyplace, and that he had not seen anybody paid money at the Cuban embassy. He also admitted that he never tried to telephone the American embassy in September, and that his first call to the embassy was after the assassination. D said that his motive in fabricating the story was to help get himself admitted into the United States so that he could there participate in action against Fidel Castro. He said that he hated Castro and hoped that the story he made up would be believed and would cause the United States to take action against him. Still later, when questioned by American authorities, D claimed that he had been pressured into retracting his statement by the Mexican police, and that the retraction rather than the first statement was false. A portion of the American questioning was carried on with the use of a polygraph machine with the consent of D. When told that the machine indicated he was probably lying, D said words to the effect that he must be mistaken. Investigation in the meantime had disclosed that the embassy extension number that D said he had called would not have given him the person he said he spoke to, and that no one at the embassy, clerks, secretaries, or officers, had any recollection of his calls. In addition, Oswald spoke little, if any, Spanish. That he could have carried on the alleged conversation with the red-headed Negro in the Cuban embassy, part of which was supposed to have been in Spanish, was therefore doubtful. D now said that he was uncertain as to the date when he saw someone who looked like Oswald at the Cuban embassy, and upon reconsideration, he now thought it was on Tuesday, September 17th, rather than September 18th. On September 17th, however, Oswald visited the Louisiana State Unemployment Commission in New Orleans and also cashed a check from the Texas Employment Commission at the Winn-Dixie store number 1425 in New Orleans. On the basis of the retractions made by D when he heard the results of the polygraph examination, and on the basis of the discrepancies which appeared in his story, it was concluded that D was lying. The investigation of the commission has thus produced no evidence that Oswald's trip to Mexico was in any way connected with the assassination of President Kennedy, nor has it uncovered evidence that the Cuban government had any involvement in the assassination. To the contrary, the commission has been advised by the CIA and FBI that secret and reliable sources corroborate the statements of Senora Duran in all material respects, and that the Cuban government had no relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald other than that described by Senora Duran. Secretary of State Rusk also testified that after the assassination, there was very considerable concern in Cuba as to whether they would be held responsible and what the effect of that might be on their own position and their own safety. Contacts with the Soviet embassy in the United States. Soon after the Oswalds reached the United States in June 1962, they wrote to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. Oswald requested information about subscriptions to Russian newspapers and magazines, and ultimately did subscribe to several Russian journals. Soviet law required Marina Oswald, as a Soviet citizen living abroad, to remain in contact with her nation's embassy and to file various papers occasionally. In 1963, after Oswald had experienced repeated employment difficulties, there were further letters when the Oswalds sought permission to return to the Soviet Union. The first such request was a letter written by Marina Oswald on February 17, 1963, She wrote that she wished to return to Russia, but that her husband would stay in the United States because he is an American by nationality. She was informed on March 8, 1963, that it would take from 5 to 6 months to process the application. The Soviet Union made available to the Commission what purports to be the entire correspondence between the Oswalds and the Russian embassy in the United States. This material has been checked for codes and none has been detected. With the possible exception of a letter which Oswald wrote to the Soviet embassy after his return from Mexico City, discussed below, there is no material which gives any reason for suspicion. The implications of all this correspondence for an understanding of Lee Harvey Oswald's personality and motivation is discussed in the following chapter. Oswald's last letter to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., dated November 9, 1963, began by stating that it was written to inform you of recent events since my meetings with Comrade Kostin in the embassy of the Soviet Union, Mexico City, Mexico. The envelope bears a postmark which appears to be November 12, 1963. Ruth Payne has testified that Oswald spent the weekend at her home working on that letter, and that she observed one preliminary draft. A piece of paper which was identified as one of these drafts was found among Oswald's effects after the assassination. According to Marina Oswald, her husband retyped the envelope 10 times. Information produced for the commission by the CIA is to the effect that the person referred to in the letter as Comrade Kostin was probably Valery Vladimirovich Kostikov, a member of the consular staff of the Soviet Union in Mexico City. He is also one of the KGB officers stationed at the embassy. It is standard Soviet procedure for KGB officers stationed in embassies and in consulates to carry on the normal duties of such a position in addition to their undercover activities. The Commission has identified the Cuban consul referred to in Oswald's letter as Senor Eusebio Azque, also Azque, the man with whom Oswald argued at the Cuban embassy, who was in fact replaced. The CIA advised the Commission, "We surmise that the references in Oswald's 9th November letter to a man who had since been replaced must refer to Cuban consul Eusebio Azque, who left Mexico for Cuba on permanent transfer on 18th November 1963, 4 days before the assassination. Azque had been in Mexico for 18 years, and it was known as early as September 1963 that Azque was to be replaced. His replacement did arrive in September. Azque was scheduled to leave in October, but he did not leave until 18th November. We do not know who might have told Oswald that Azque or any other Cuban had been or was to be replaced, but we speculate that Sylvia Duran or some Soviet official might have mentioned it if Oswald complained about Azque's altercation with him. When asked to explain the letter, Marina Oswald was unable to add anything to an understanding of its contents. Some light on its possible meaning can be shed by comparing it with the early draft. When the differences between that draft and the final document are studied, and especially when crossed-out words are taken into account, it becomes apparent that Oswald was intentionally beclouding the true state of affairs in order to make his trip to Mexico sound as mysterious and important as possible. For instance, the first sentence in the second paragraph of the letter reads, "I was unable to remain in Mexico indefinitely because of my Mexican visa restrictions, which was for 15 days only." The same sentence in the draft begins, before the words are crossed out, "I was unable to remain in Mexico City because I considered useless." As already mentioned, the Commission has good evidence that Oswald's trip to Mexico was indeed useless and that he returned to Texas with that conviction. The first draft, therefore, spoke the truth, but Oswald rewrote that sentence to imply that he had to leave because his visa was about to expire. This is false. Oswald's tourist card still had a full week to run when he departed from Mexico on October 3rd. The next sentence in the letter reads, I could not take a chance on requesting a new visa unless I used my real name, so I returned to the United States. The fact is that he did use his real name for his tourist card, and in all dealings with the Cuban embassy, the Russian embassy, and elsewhere. Oswald did use the name of Lee on the trip, but as indicated below, he did so only sporadically and probably as the result of a clerical error. In the opinion of the Commission, based upon its knowledge of Oswald, the letter constitutes no more than a clumsy effort to ingratiate himself with the Soviet embassy. End of section 30. Recording by Maria Casper.
Okay, yeah, we'll take a break for that. And we'll pick up at section 7, 8, and 9 tomorrow at 2 Central. Hey, Katie, welcome in. Just finished it up. But yeah, I can see what the reports, why there's the connection between Russia and China and Russia, Cuba, and the United States with what was going on there. It was all the emails that he was doing, or not the emails, letters he was doing to Cuba and to Russia, and his lies. GI, okay. Yeah, this is a long section. Nothing out of the ordinary in that one. I just noticed just a lot of things that were said later on. Oh, hi. Okay. A lot of things that are said later on that they used these basically fabricated stories to bolster them. Because they had the supposed Cuban plot, Russian involvement, yeah. So yeah, seems like there's a lot of miscommunications, a lot of misfacts that were being used and later and called out as information that does not fully fit the needs of the story. All right. Yeah, I think I'll shut down for now and come back on later, probably after dinner. Thanks for everybody for coming in. Thanks for the gifts. And of course, always, I'll be here when I can. Thank you.
We are the champions. No time.